Hello, everyone. My name is Luca Aiken. Welcome back again to the Common Ground podcast. Today, we're going to be exploring a very interesting question, which is diplomacy dead? And I'm joined today by Benjamin Mosseri, a good friend of
Hey,
mine who I met at Thymun, the International United Nations Conference. I'll let Benjamin introduce himself.
hey, I'm Benjamin Mosseri. I am a 16-year-old high school student living in Germany, and I'm very interested in politics and international politics. It's kind of something that I've based a lot of my educational career around. So,
Yeah, exactly. He was a great delegate. He was the delegate of the UK and I was Spain, and we worked together on a few resolutions, and that was great. And one of the speeches we heard at the end of this conference, which was quite moving, was given by this Secretary General, and it was essentially saying, reaffirming what Mark Carney said at Davos, which is diplomacy is kind of dead with the US. Like, what is the point of coming to a United Nations conference if the United Nations itself doesn't really work? Which, we have our different opinions. So that's what we're going to get into today. And so my first question is, Ben, from your perspective as a German, how has the United States' role in like global diplomacy, particularly in recent years, within the last year, do you think, allies still trust the US in the same way? Do you think Germany still trusts the US?
I think if we're talking about bilateral diplomacy, it's a little more complicated. You see this trend of the United States sanctioning everything that they don't like under the Trump administration, making it complicated for a lot of its trade partners to really be able to trust it. Now, if the German regime trusts the Trump regime is a very complicated question. Under the the Prime Minister Friedrich Merz, there is has been actually a lot of effort to kind of appeal or appease to the Trump regime, but other European leaders such as Macron, they've had hard times trusting them. But if you go to slightly more right leaders like in Italy, in Germany, probably in Austria, I would guess that they're more trusting of the Trump regime.
Yeah, exactly. That actually leads me into like, a further thing on domestic policy in Germany. There's a large increase in the right movement and its growing popularity in Germany. Why do you think that is in recent years?
Well, we can always go back to this trend of Germans sort of being unhappy, and you can see this all around Europe. There has been a huge rise in right parties. The right party is in power in Hungary, in Austria. It is in a recent vote, the far extreme party of Germany is thought to be the next ruling party of Germany, even though by German law it is actually maybe getting restricted for being too extreme. So, the reason for this, as far as I see it, is that a lot of people are unhappy with what has happened in the past, and they see maybe a trend of global economic decline for these um, richer nations or pensioners not being able to pay their rent, and it kind of they're just looking for a change, and that's why people are extremifying, no matter if it is to the extreme left or the extreme right. It is kind of a way to move away from the Overton window that is currently in place.
Totally. I mean, I think, yeah, it's just global resentment in a way. And, coming from my Spanish background, the Vox Party, which is a conservative party in Spain, has grown a lot of steam and a lot of popularity, particularly among kids. And it's concerning, whether you like the party or not, that the country is going in such extreme directions.
Yeah.
Um, I think, but partially, I found that what Trump has done within the last year with, placing tariffs on the European Union, testing the bond of NATO, saying ridiculous comments, and just being, not a good diplomat, has possibly maybe led Europeans more to the center because they might feel that to actually beat the US and to actually contend with the US, they can't go in such extremes. And it's almost like if the US starts to, like remove funding, if it starts to remove funding from NATO, if it starts to stop backing the European Union as a whole, what does that mean for Europe? I think it means, they have to come together and be that middle path, like Mark Carney said, and not actually fight with among themselves, but more so fight with the US. Yeah,
I mean, yeah, I think it's a little more nuanced than that. If the US leaves NATO, it's a huge issue. But the thing is that the US won't. Europe is, if Europe were a country, sadly it's a confederation, if Europe were a country, it'd be the strongest economy in the world, and the US needs that. If they were to now cut ties with the European Union, leave NATO, then it would be a huge problem for the American economy.
yeah, yeah, for sure.
I mean, if I answered your question.
No, totally. Um, yeah, I think it's a very complex issue. Obviously, the US likes to, and Western media, or not Western, but I mean, American media tends to kind of group Europe all in one boat, group Germany, France, Spain, and Italy all in one boat when they all have this strictly distinct cultures. They speak a different language. There's so much more going on there, which kind of
Yeah.
US fails to encapsulate. Leading off of that, like I said, like I led this conversation with, we met each other at an MUN conference. But do you think in the real world, the United Nations continues to make meaningful decisions, prevent conflict, or has it become mainly a symbolic organization?
Well, as as an MUN kid, I like to be optimistic about these things. But it's really hard in a time like this. I live in Berlin. The Berlin has around, I think, a $40 billion US dollar budget yearly. The UN has a $30 billion budget. So if you think about it, a institution that is supposed to be dealing with global cooperation between global superpowers has less funding than like a medium-sized city, or okay, a decently large city. This kind of shows how, I mean, although diplomacy isn't dead as you framed it, it is dying. The United States has been lowering its funding for the United Nations, so has the United Kingdom, and so have so many other um nations around the world because they don't believe that it is a meaningful organ. However, I think that the power that it holds and the power it has to foster diplomacy is far more important than many countries make it out to be.
Yeah. I totally agree. I think a good friend of mine once told me, we were talking about the United Nations, and he kind of said, he made me change my lens. He said, the UN actually serves its purpose. Its purpose is to bring to get people together in a global forum to hash it out, and to provide diplomacy. But the UN's purpose is not to solve global issues. The UN's purpose is not to, I mean, sometimes they make it their purpose with peacekeeping troops to go into foreign countries and actually like take action, but that's not their purpose on paper. Their purpose on paper is to foster diplomacy. And you're right. I think if without the correct funding, which it doesn't have, it can't really facilitate anything. And then also, if we're seeing world superpowers like the US start to go back on their treaties, start to remove themselves and slowly but surely break ties with the allies they've had for decades, it it draws into question, do we even need to use this body any longer? Right.
Yeah.
But I think we do. And like a fellow MUN kid, I believe that the younger generation, ourselves included, are looking to the future to, bridge divides rather than, and although it sounds corny, talk it out rather than go
Mhm.
to the battlefield, because I can tell you our generation doesn't want to get drafted. Um, I feel I don't have statistics, but as a whole, our generation, even though there's far right nationalist movements growing, our generation is probably the least nationalist that there has been within the last century. And that's definitely because of the more globalized world we live in. And of course, it depends on the country, it depends on where you live, but it depends on your uprising. But I'd say, at least among the kids I've met, uh, through the countries I've lived in, people don't really have a strong sense of national identity, which is what these far right parties are trying to encapsulate.
Yeah. But I also think that um we as I would say comparatively relatively well off people in the world
Yeah.
have been kind of focused to a certain demographic or political ideology of people. So, um, most or a lot of the people who vote for these right-wing parties are actually poor, and therefore they have kind of nationalism to cling to. So I think that the people that we've talked to, yes, are not very nationalistic. However, I think that we kind of have been focused on a certain group of people.
Yeah, I agree. But yeah, I mean, I was kind of overgeneralizing when I was saying our generation as a whole. But, statistically, I'm sure, like, I say it because, there is so much more information that we consume on a daily basis. And there is less reason to be so dependent on our nation and to be so dependent on what the media is feeding us or,
Yeah,
standardized media.
I
I have
completely agree.
I have good friends, Spanish friends particularly, who are not necessarily nationalists, but much more
Patriot.
conservative, patriotic. I mean, this whole term, I mean, nationalist is an extreme term, but the idea of patriotism has gotten blown out of proportion as well. Um, to be a patriotic is to love one's country and to support it. And I think I have many friends in the US, in Spain, who are patriotic, and I have many who aren't. And,
Yeah.
um, we're seeing that reflected now with diplomacy and how much people are actually caring. And
Hmm.
so let's move into the real question here. Is diplomacy dead? Is it dying? Is it dead? Or is it just evolving into something more transactional and feeding off of power?
Well, I think it's pretty easy to say that it's not dead, but I also think it's equally easy to say that it's dying. You can see this, as I've already stated, through the funding of the UN um, being in, like infinitely low compared to what it should be. The UN can't even it's understaffed and it can't pay the staff that it has. So that's one issue multilaterally. But if you see the relations between the most powerful country in the world, the United States, and its closest allies, you can also see there that diplomacy is dying. The United States has put very little recently. The United States has put very little to no effort into keeping diplomacy alive, even between it and its closest allies. Obviously, the United States is going to be less than diplomatic with Russia. However, when it comes to France, it should maybe put a little bit more of an effort in.
I agree. Yeah, completely. I think I I think it is in a stage where it's dying, but it's in a stage where it's salvageable, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
like I like to always bring it back to Mark Carney because I think that was pivotal in almost the history of well, within the last decade, that was pivotal in the global order. What his speech said, because it resonated with a lot of people and it kind of sang it for what it was. And that is, middle powers like Germany, like Canada, can no longer rely on the US, which may be true, but that doesn't mean that we need to abandon what's worked for the last 80 years. Or I mean, at times worked and at times not, but it's been an order. Um,
Yeah.
and I,
And I
I'd
think
be
what's important. Oh, yeah, continue.
No, no, no. That's it.
I think what's important to realize is like my good friend James Simonovitz, the DSG, said, it's important to recognize that I have more in common with a Somali kid as a upper slash middle class person in Germany than I don't. I think this is a direct quote from his speech, and it really was, in my opinion, the most powerful part. It really like we're all humans. We shouldn't be fighting over meaningless things. And as corny as it may seem, as you've already said, we should talk it out. I think the power of speech, the power of communication is one of the most powerful inventions that humans have ever made.
Yeah, completely. And the power of forums and bringing people together um, is incredibly powerful as well. And so, on that note, what is one message that you would like to tell the younger generation, kids our age and kids younger,
Yeah.
on how we can come together, find common ground, and revive diplomacy?
Well, to be honest, I don't think it gets you much younger than me, but to people watching this in the future, let's say, I think it's important to recognize that every single person would rather have angry or even violent conversation with someone than be drafted to the front lines over resources that they can't access. It's really important to see how powerful communication is. In a world without communication, instead of talking to my dad because he doesn't let me out, I punch him in the face and then I get beaten up. So it's really just communication is key.
Yeah, I completely agree. All right, Benjamin. Thank you so much for joining me today. Um,
It's a
and
pleasure.
it was a pleasure having you on Common Ground.
Thank you.